So, arthropods. We are moving on. We ended last time with roundworms who have a flexible cuticle. Arthropods also have a flexible cuticle, which puts them in the group ecdysozoans. And 2 out of every 3 known species of animals are arthropods. You find these guys everywhere. They're in the soil, in the air, flying, in the oceans, in freshwater. They are ubiquitous. There we go. Where did they come from? So the key advancement here, so we've been going through these groups and getting advancements in each group. So the arthropod body plan is we're now adding segmentation. We had segmentation in annelids, in the worms, but that was just a bunch of repeated segments. There was no real diversity in segments. That's what we get here. We have a full coelom, but we have segments that are now adapted to a bunch of different things. We also have a hard exoskeleton and jointed appendages. So from each segment, you sort of think of it as the possibility of a new thing. Every segment that gets added, it can be adapted to a new set of appendages, walking legs, swimming legs, claws, and that's the real key here. The arthropod body plan dates back to the Cambrian period, and we see a huge diversity of arthropods come out of that period. And what we see, as you might expect, is the early arthropods had segmentation, but not a lot of difference from one segment to the next, kind of like earthworms. So here is a trilobite. They have 3 basic regions. They have the head region, they have this middle part made of a lot of repeated segments, and then they have this tail piece that's a bunch of segments fused into one chunk. So not a whole lot of differentiation other than having a very distinct head region with sensory organs and a mouth. So that's a trilobite. These guys were a very successful group. We don't have anything alive, any of their relatives alive today, but they survived a long, long, long time and were very diverse. So this is, as we watch arthropods through time, we typically see a decrease in the number of segments, which is sort of counterintuitive, but what you have are a bunch of segments fusing into one body part. And as that's happening, we're seeing appendages, legs, arms, wings, swimmerettes, becoming more and more specialized for niches. So basically, you think of their appendages as a toolbox that allow them to get really specialized to do one thing or another and really focus in on a niche. We think our best guess is that a lot of these this reduction in segmentation came from changes to the Hox genes. Hox genes, as always, are super critical. So there was an experiment done on this little wormy dude called an onychophoran. There's still onychophorans alive today. And you can see it's a wormy looking thing, but it has these legs and a weird antenna thing on it. So we have a worm with segments and appendages, which kind of makes you think, oh, this is maybe some kind of insect or arthropod ancestor. So we did the genetics of this, specifically the Hox genes. So what we see here is all of these segments, all of these legs represent the expression of different Hox genes. And we thought that the onychophorans might be an early arthropod ancestor. What the genetics told us was no, they're not. They're a separate group off of arthropods, but don't represent some sort of ancestral form. So the question still continues, where did they come from? So the general characteristics of arthropods, again, modification of the legs and appendages is sort of the key. We have appendages modified for walking, for feeding functions, for sensory organs, reproductive, defense appendages, for flight, all sorts of different things. One of the characteristics is typically these appendages come in pairs. So here's a classic arthropod. We have two pinchers. We have mouth parts that come in pairs. If you've ever looked closely at a crab or lobster's mouth, there's all kinds of appendages in there. It's not just like two things for grabbing food. It's crazy. I'll show you a video in a second. But we have a bunch of antennae, again, in pairs. We have walking legs in pairs. And then we have swimming appendages near the tail. One thing about the crabs and shrimp and lobsters is they sort of have two regions. They have a fused cephalothorax. So the head and thorax region are fused into one chunk. And then the abdomen typically is many segments. So lobster, here is the mouth of a lobster. Brace yourself, watch all this movement. So we have all sorts of different maxillae arms, pedipalps, maxillipeds, just all kinds of different arms and legs, and they're all adapted to help feed and filter out food and bring things into the mouth. So if you've never thought about lobsters before, prepare to have nightmares now. Anybody freaked out? Oh, question in the chat. The survey was just to know if you wanted these as just an MP3 rather than a video. Nobody voted that they wanted an MP3, so I'll just keep posting the videos. Okay, so that was lobster mouth parts. It is very spider-like, yeah. And that's just the mouth. So we do have a flexible cuticle called an exoskeleton made of a lot of layers. So what happens is the outermost layer of cells secretes this protein substance. And on top of that protein substance, we get chitin, which is a sugar. So it goes cells, protein layer, chitin, and the chitin itself is the exoskeleton. When they grow, they have to molt because they can't, that chitin doesn't expand. So they need to shed the exoskeleton through a process called ecdysis. What happens is they will absorb the protein layer back into the cells, which creates a gap. So you have the chitin exoskeleton, then a gap, and then the cells. And that frees them from the exoskeleton. They crawl out of the exoskeleton, they secrete the proteins, they secrete the chitin, and now they have a new exoskeleton. Pretty weird stuff. Arthropods have any kind of sensory organ you can imagine. A lot of people think that the mantis shrimp have some of the most sophisticated sensory organs in the entire animal kingdom. Butterflies can smell with their feet, all kinds of different sensory adaptations for touch, for smell, for sound. Just depends on what that organism has adapted. Arthropods have open circulation, a lot like clams, versus closed circulation like us and squids and other things. So they have one big body cavity that just circulates the fluids. The fluids inside are a combination of their blood, which is a bluish, greenish blood because it's not iron-based, it's copper-based, along with lymph. So it's called hemolymph. It's both blood and lymphatic fluids that just circulate. Um, they have a variety of organs for gas exchange, for breathing. So there are book gills and modified lungs and actual gills. Sometimes gills are on appendages. So you see lots of specialized breathing apparatus. So based on morphology, we separated these guys into these groups. Actually, I'm sorry, morphology and molecular. They used to be separated even more, but molecular sort of brought things together. So we have three groups of arthropods. The chelicerates, ticks, spiders, mites, scorpions, as well as some other smaller groups. Those are chelicerates. We'll talk about what that word means in a minute. We have the myriapods. These are the things with lots of legs. Your millipedes and centipedes. And then we have pancrustacea. Pancrustacea used to be split into more groups, but we found out through molecular evidence that they should be one group, and that includes the lobsters, the crabs, the shrimp, as well as the insects. So crabs and bumblebees are now both in pancrustacea. Pan means everywhere. So we've had to combine them based on the DNA evidence. So we'll go through these groups one at a time. The chelicerates are in the group Chelicerata because of some feeding appendages called, you got it, chelicerae. They have an anterior cephalothorax, so their head is fused into that cephalothorax region. And they have an abdomen at the back. So the abdomen can vary a lot depending on the group, but they all have this fused head and thorax region. One of the earliest groups is known as a eurypterid or a sea scorpion. These things could have been up to 14 feet long. Think of a giant swimming scorpion with claws and like a lobster-like tail. So these guys were the top of the food chain when they were around. They are not actually directly related to scorpions. They just sort of have a scorpion look to them. So eurypterids were these crazy things. So most of the marine chelicerates, including the eurypterids, are extinct now. One of the few major groups are the horseshoe crabs. So our little limulus guys that we have coming up in the Delaware beach, probably in another month, if you go to the Delaware beaches during a full moon, you will see thousands upon thousands of marine chelicerates. Very, very cool and ancient species, or group of species. That's what it looks like, but that doesn't even capture how many there are. If you go to a place like Slaughter Beach and you look up and down the beach, it'll be just this as far as you can see. And not just on land, but in the water, 10 feet out, there'll just be piles of horseshoe crabs, because all the horseshoe crabs in the Atlantic Ocean come here every year to mate. All the adults anyway. So we basically have this huge population influx in the spring of every year. It's pretty remarkable. Most of the modern chelicerates now are known as arachnids, spiders, scorpions, and ticks, as well as some of the mites. So there's your scorpion, again, fused cephalothorax, but then the abdomen region is very segmented. But then in the spiders and mites, we have the abdomen being fused into one big lump. So there's a web-building spider, something like a common garden spider that you would find in the fall. Dust mites. We all have mites in our eyebrows right now. They're very, very small. So the key here is they're chelicerates, and you can see hanging off of this mite, these are the chelicera. I'll show you a better picture here in a second. But that's something that they all have in common, are these feeding appendages. Arachnids, so spiders, contrary to popular thought, they do not have 8 total appendages. They actually have 12 appendages. They have 8 walking legs. But then they also have a set of pedipalps, which are face legs. So they have 2 legs coming off of their face. And they also have chelicera, so 2 feeding appendages. So on a spider's face, there are 4 appendages, and then there are 8 appendages for walking. In spiders, they breathe through something called book lungs. They're basically these stacked gills, like pages in a book, in their abdomen that they use for gas exchange. Some very cool adaptations: spider silk, which spider silk is a liquid protein that the spider can adjust how those proteins fold and adjust the stickiness, the tensile strength, the thickness. They can do really cool stuff with their silk, obviously. But that's a very specialized spider feature. So here we have a spider in cross-section. We would have gotten to do a spider dissection in lab, but it's really not much to see. They're mostly just mushy inside, and it's hard to see what's going on. So the pedipalps are these jointed legs that come out of the face. The chelicera are the fangs. So we have chelicera on mites and scorpions as well. And then of course, we have the 8 walking legs. Here are the book lungs, and you can see the lungs are stacked in these, it looks like pages in a book. They have a heart that spans sort of the length of the abdomen. And a lot like in earthworms, we see this segmented multi-chambered heart that just circulates hemolymph throughout this chamber. So no blood vessels or anything like that. What would make someone allergic to a spider bite? Allergy is just your immune system attacking a foreign substance. So anytime your immune system recognizes something as foreign, that's an allergy. A lot of spider venom is toxic in different ways. So you have recluse venom, black widow venom, and they all attack different parts. So some of them cause necrosis or basically make you rot. Others attack your nervous system. So spider venom is... spider bite years ago and had a baseball in my leg. Yeah, that's common. You probably had some sort of cyst in there that your immune system formed. So that's chelicerates. We have the myriapods. Pretty simple group. 2 major members of this. We have the millipedes and the centipedes. So myriapod is just 2 groups. These guys are more ancestral because they don't have a lot of specialization. They're all terrestrial, so they're all land-based. They all have a pair of antennae and 3 pairs of appendages for mouth parts. Beyond the antenna and the mouth parts, every segment is going to get either 1 set of legs or 2 sets of legs. Something interesting in this group, the millipedes are all plant eaters. They usually eat dead and decaying plant material, not living plant material. So here's kind of a weird thing in biology. I don't know of any exceptions to that. All millipedes are non-carnivorous, eating dead plant material. And in the millipedes, they have 2 sets of legs per trunk segment. So if you look at a millipede, you get one. You look at a segment, there's going to be 4 legs coming off of each segment. And that's classic millipede. Also, they tend to be very dome-shaped. So there's a millipede, and if you look very closely, you can see the segments with 2 legs coming off per segment. Here's a centipede. This is a lot clearer. Here's a segment with one set of legs. Centipedes are much more flattened, and they're all carnivores. So we have the millipedes being all vegetarians and the centipedes being all carnivores. Again, that's sort of a weird thing in biology. Yes, we have dust mites in our eyebrows right now. Actually, not dust mites, you have eyebrow mites. So the centipedes are carnivores. One set of legs per segment. They have poison claws that can be dangerous to us. The most common centipede is going to be the house centipede. When I was a kid, we called them thousand-leggers. If you go in your basement right now, you have some of them. They're actually really beneficial predators to have around. They're just going to eat pests. The house centipede's venom can hurt you, but their chelicera are so small. I'm sorry, not chelicera. Their venom-injecting appendages are so small that they can't penetrate your skin. So there are very rare cases of people being hurt by house centipede venom, but it's super rare. Like one of the few places that your skin is thin enough is your eyelids. So I guess if you get a house centipede on your eyelid, look out. But for the most part, they're beneficial things to have in your house. Everybody hates the poor house centipedes. Come on. I actually did too for a long time till I learned about their ecology. I'm like, you stay in the basement and we're cool. They are horrifying. So the last group is the pancrustaceans. Everybody's like hating on the house centipedes right now. Quit it. Pancrustacea, this is our insects and all of our ocean-dwelling crustaceans. So we used to separate them out as two groups. We had the crustacea and we had the hexapods. Hexapods were the land-based insects. The crustaceans were the ocean-based buggy things. But we recently learned that they're together. Genetically, they're more closely related to each other than they are to things like centipedes. So we lump them together. Interestingly, there's some lineages of crustaceans, things called remipods, that are more closely related to insects than the remipods are related to things like crabs. So we have these weird connections of ocean and land-based things, that not all ocean-based things are more closely related to each other than they are to land-based things. So together, the insects and the crustaceans are pancrustacea. They're the remipedians, more commonly known as remipods. It is a crustacean group, and we think that they're more closely related to insects. So they would share a common ancestor. So we have the chelicerates being our outgroup, the myriapods being the outgroup to that, and then the crustaceans and insects being together. Everybody's still hating on the poor house centipedes. Oh, man. So we still talk about these guys as separate. So the crustaceans are the marine and freshwater ones. A lot of them have really highly specialized appendages. We saw the lobster mouth parts. And some of the small crustaceans are going to exchange gases through their cuticle. So they breathe directly through their cuticle, which is kind of cool. Larger crustaceans actually have gills. The surface area is not great enough for cuticle breathing, so they have to have specialized gills, things like lobsters. So most crustaceans have separate male and female sexes. The isopods are one group that actually is on land and water. So isopods are pill bugs. Right now, if you went outside and flipped over a log, you'd probably find pill bugs under the log. They actually have gills and they need to remain in a moist environment, but they don't need to be underwater. We also have crabs that are terrestrial as well. There's land crabs, coconut crabs, all kinds of stuff that are crabs that live primarily on land. So isopods aren't the only group that can sort of switch between that have species that are terrestrial and aquatic. Crabs and other things do as well. The decapods are the large group within Crustacea that we all know and love: the lobsters, the crabs, the crayfish, and the shrimp. I just like his eyebrows, little ghost crab's eyebrows. Most crustaceans form or have, let me start over. There's crustaceans who are planktonic, meaning they're little microscopic guys. There's a little guy called a Daphnia, which is a really common crustacean that we find in lakes around here. They don't live in rivers and streams because they can't handle the current. But if you get into any lake in the middle of summer and you pull a net through with fine enough mesh, you'll pull up dozens and dozens of these microscopic plankton. They're some of the most numerous animals in the world. It also includes things like krill, which would be the marine bottom of the food chain type of food for tons of stuff. So there's a little krill, very shrimp-like bottom of the food chain guy. Barnacles are crustaceans as well. They look, I don't know, sort of like a clam or coral or something else, just superficially because they have a hard shell. But barnacles are actually more related to crabs and things. They are sessile crustaceans, meaning they're stuck to the bottom, and they secrete a calcium carbonate shell, much like a clam does, but they are not in any way related to clams. So there is an example of a gooseneck barnacle, and it's one of the things that Darwin was very, very, very into. So Darwin took the trip on the Beagle, and he got back. He had all these ideas, but he just settled down and started studying barnacles, and he was the world's expert in barnacles. As a matter of fact, I'm currently reading the book Darwin and the Barnacle, sort of outlining how he used barnacles to help him become a renowned scientist, a respected scientist, so that people eventually took him very seriously. So, it's cool. Gooseneck. Insects. Insects are hexapods, meaning they have 6 walking legs. Typically walking, jumping, whatever you want to call it. It also includes other relatives of insects. So we find these guys everywhere, except marine environments. So we find them in freshwater, we find them in land, we find them in the ground, we find them in the air. The internal anatomy is relatively complex. Interestingly, their immune system mostly relies on their cuticle. If they do get a disease that gets into them, they don't have a whole lot of an immune system to fight something. So most of their protection is just keep stuff out, which is sort of interesting. Another dissection we would have gotten to do, the grasshopper, the Luber grasshopper. And these guys, because they are herbivores, they have crop for storing food, tracheal tubes for breathing. So on the outside, you'll find little holes that allow air in. The trachea extend throughout the body that circulate air. We have some glands here to aid in digestion. Again, like earthworms, we have hearts in the segmentation in the abdomen. So back here where the abdomen looks a little wormy, there's these repeating structures. So again, that idea of segmentation is really important. We have more digestive organs called Malphingian tubules. Their nerve cord runs along their ventral surface, their belly, as opposed to vertebrates, dorsal. They typically have separate sexes. This would be a girl because you have ovaries and a vagina, and the anus, obviously. So basic grasshopper anatomy there. So why are insects so important? I think this is an essay question on the study guide. Insects have actually had several periods of huge diversification since they came out onto land. The first major adaptation was feeding on gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are the things like pine trees, cone-bearing plants. And these were some of the first woody plants on land as well. So insects first adapted to feed on things like pine needles and other gymnosperms, which was huge. The gymnosperms became the dominant land plant. The insects diversified to feed on them. At the end of the period of dinosaurs, so about 75 million years ago, some new plants started to show up, the flowering plants. And flowering plants are in a group called angiosperms. And what we see is the insects rapidly adapting to flowers. So we see another rapid adaptation, co-adaptation between the flowers and the insects, where flowers gave rise to new insect species aided the diversity of flowers. So we have this engine of evolution. They're driving each other to adapt, because it's all about reproduction, and they've really worked well together. What we see is when the dinosaurs went extinct, we see a drop-off in insect diversity. Because there wasn't much food, a lot of the flower lineages died off. But then after that, we have this huge explosion of all the modern insects that we see today, as well as all the flowering plants that we have today. So pretty interesting. Another key to the success of these guys is flight. Insects have evolved flight probably at least 5 times independently. So insect wings are not all the same. Think about a dragonfly versus a bee versus a beetle. Trying to think of another one that can fly. Grasshopper. Those are probably all, butterflies, duh. They probably all have separate evolutionary origins of flight. So we don't just have one flying insect ancestor, which is pretty cool. So that would be like a paraphyletic group. And to stress that, we have totally different muscle attachments in different wing types, but all wings are some kind of extension of the exoskeleton. They're not separate like legs. They're actually part of the exoskeleton that's been adapted. And again, they have different muscle connections and all different sorts of adaptations. So flight was one of the keys to adaptation. So feeding on gymnosperms, adapting to flowers, and evolving flight many, many times are the keys to why we have so many. So there's one of the worst flyers in the insect group, the beetles. They have the hard covering, the beetle shell, and they have these very delicate wings underneath. They're terrible flyers, but they can fly. Do you ever have a beetle fly into the side of your head? They're not good at control, versus a dragonfly that can just hover and go backwards and go all over the place. So again, very, very different flight. I'm expecting to see like things in the chat about beetles flying into people's eyes or something.
Hold on, I have a story.
Yes,
what
please.
beetle has like they like scream, or I don't know what it was. I was driving one time in Middle Creek with my girlfriend, and it was getting like darker, and I had my window down, and it hit me in the head, and it was making this loud, like, screeching noise, and I didn't know what was going on, and I stopped, but the thing got stuck in my car, and I did not want to get back in the car. And but yeah, we did finally get it out, but I never had anything like that happen. I couldn't believe it happened. I got like knocked in the head. This thing was screaming. It was huge.
Did it look like this?
It was huge. Yeah, it was big. I couldn't believe it. What is that?
It's a cicada.
Yeah, it was screaming. It sounded like a woman was being murdered. I got hit in the head. I'm in the middle of the woods. I swear to God, I'm not making this up. I wish I was.
Is anyone impressed that I have a cicada sculpture at hand? Yeah, so they are actually totally harmless and kind of tasty. So their only defense is making a loud noise. They can't bite you. They can't scratch you. They have nothing. They're basically just food that is loud. Um,
Are they slowly dying out or something? Because every year it seems like it takes longer for them to show up around my house. We used to have like tons.
That's
no,
a good point, though. I've noticed that.
no, they are on a 17-year breeding cycle. So we only see huge swarms of them every 17 years. Now there are some 12-year ones. There's a bunch of different groups of them that will come out at different times. Sometimes they get into a super cycle where two groups will go at the same time. I think Ohio had one last year. But it's regional, and it's there's all these different groups that come out at different times. So I think maybe 5 or 6 years we had a super swarm. But yeah, most years it's pretty low key, and then some years they'll just be everywhere. But it's because they stay underground feeding on plant roots and only come out to breed once every 7 to 17 years, depending on the grouping. So, yeah, kind of it's a cool predator adaptation to predators because they have no defense. There's no predator that can adapt to a 17-year swarm because nobody can wait around 17 years for their next meal. So it's pretty neat that that's sort of what they do. They just come out in such huge numbers that birds can't eat them all. There's so many. They also can't specialize on them because they're so infrequent. So cool.
Yeah.
So are they the ones that burrow and make the holes in the ground?
Yes. Yep. Typically around tree roots and things, you'll find them.
Brad,
Yeah.
how do the insects adapt to flowers?
So you'll have the flowers making specialized structures for specific insects. So some flowers are beetle pollinated. So they have special structures that beetles can feed on. Other flowers are specialized for butterflies. That the way that the flower is shaped, only a butterfly can get to the nectar. So the flowers adapt to the insects, but then the insects adapt to the flowers. So there are some species of flowers that can only be pollinated by a single moth. That's super specialized. So they go through this coevolution. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Also colors. Like if you see a tiny little purple flower close to the ground, like violets, those are ant dispersed versus a red flower that's sort of cone shaped. That's going to be hummingbird and butterfly pollinated. So tons and tons and tons of adaptation drive diversity. Okay. So within the insects, there's two types of metamorphosis. We have incomplete. This is where the young are considered nymphs, where they resemble the adults, but are just small versions of the adults and go through a series of molts, basically just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But all along, it looks like the adult. The way we define an adult is the reproductively active form. So incomplete metamorphosis, you have things that look the same as they're growing, versus complete metamorphosis, like a butterfly goes from an egg to a caterpillar to a chrysalis to a butterfly. We have 4 distinct life stages of a butterfly. That's complete metamorphosis. You couldn't look at a caterpillar and say, oh yeah, it's going to become a butterfly. That's totally different. The cicada that we just talked about, they have a little buggy form that lives underground. When they do their final molt to come out, they get wings and they get huge and all this other stuff. That's a complete metamorphosis. The larval stage doesn't look anything like the adult. So complete metamorphosis have larvae. Incomplete metamorphosis has nymphs. So sort of a key distinction in terminology there. Nymph means you look like the adult. Larva means you don't look like the adult. There's a beautiful monarch going through the stages of a chrysalis. The chrysalis is actually a unique life stage. While it's in there, its organs are being totally rearranged. It's growing new organs like a reproductive system, brand new respiratory system, and when it comes out, it's obviously different. So here's a video, butterfly coming out.
Are there things that will eat them while they're in a chrysalis?
Not many.
Why?
What?
Why?
Because they're toxic.
Oh. All butterflies and moths that form a chrysalis are toxic while they're in there?
No, monarchs are. There are some chrysalis that will get eaten, but they're usually very inconspicuous, and the chrysalis doesn't last long. I find fritillary chrysalis in the fall all around, but typically they last like 1 day, that 1 to 2 maybe. They'll form these chrysalis. They're cool. They have like copper dots on them, and they're real small. They're very inconspicuous, and they don't last long. The monarch chrysalis, the caterpillars eat toxic milkweed, which makes them toxic. So anything that would, even an adult monarch retains that toxic chemical from eating the milkweed. So cool. I highly recommend going to a butterfly house if you've never done. Not right now though. Wait a couple months.
We went to one in Costa Rica. It was incredible.
Yeah. More locally, the Hershey Gardens, it has a great butterfly house. So that's.
Yeah, but have you gone there with small children?
Yeah.
Because I'm sure lovely ladies who were staffing the place just followed us around and issued threats the whole time.
You got to flex your biology at them. Just be like, oh, the chrysalis phase is. I don't even know.
I think they were positive I was going to let the children swat all of the butterflies.
No, when I was there, it was great. I had nothing like that. It was actually snowing outside when I was there, which was pretty cool to see these, because it's like 90 degrees in there all the time. So to see the snow like hitting with all the butterflies flying around. Okay, so we'll finish up insects, and that'll be it for today. So the insects have separate male and female sexes. They have all sorts of different reproductive rituals, bright colors, sounds. The reason the cicadas make such a racket is because they're attracting mates. Some of them have odors. Things like moths secrete powerful pheromones. The males have those feather-looking antennae that receive the female's pheromones, and they can find the females based on the smell. So lots of reproductive adaptations there. Some insects are beneficial as pollinators, obviously. It's estimated that half of the world's food supply is directly reliant on insect pollinators. And with the collapse of a lot of bees, we're kind of seeing the results of losing pollinators. Certain goods are becoming more expensive because of that. So while others are harmful other insects are obviously harmful. They can sting you, they can bite you, they carry diseases. Speaking of pandemics, the Black Plague was spread by a flea, which is an insect. Pest crops right now, this time of year I get nervous about cucumber beetles destroying my cucumbers and zucchinis, and how I can prevent that. These are the things I think about. But insects are hugely diverse. We can't think of them as bad or good. They are what they are. So very quickly, here are some of the orders. Coleoptera, the beetles, also including the weevils and things. Diptera are the flies. Hymenoptera are the wasp bees and things. Lepidopterans are the butterflies and moths. Hemiopterans are the true bugs that have sucking mouth parts. Those are the only ones that you can technically call bugs. Orthoptera are going to be your grasshoppers, your crickets, your katydids. So you don't need to remember any of those. I'm not going to ask you about them. Skip through this. Actually, we'll finish up the chapter today. We got a little bit of time. So the deuterostomes are our last group. Now, we are deuterostomes. We are obviously not invertebrates. So this is a totally separate group. We did Lophotrochozoans, we did Ecdysozoans, and here we are in deuterostomes, the third group of invertebrates. Major differences: radial cleavage versus spiral cleavage of the embryos. Formation of the anus first from the blastopore. There are other animals who do have deuterostome development that are not in the deuterostome group. So we can define the group Deuterostomia only by genetics. So you can't just look at embryonic development. You got to go to genetics. So here we are in the last group. We did sponges, we did jellyfish, the Lophotrochozoans, the Ecdysozoans, and the deuterostomes. The major group here are the echinoderms. Echinoderms are going to be your starfish, your classic starfish, as well as other groups. Echinoderm means spiny skin, slow-moving, mostly sessile. They do move, but for the most part, not very fast. They have a thin outer covering of skin. So if you touch a starfish, what you're touching is actually skin, but right underneath that skin are bony plates. That's why they are spiny skin, echinoderm, because those bony calcium plates are right underneath the epidermis. Echinoderms are cool because they have a water vascular system, which means that a lot of their movement is used by hydraulics. They pump water in and out to move their arms, extend tube feet, all this other stuff. Males and females are typically separate, and they have external reproduction, meaning they release their gametes into the water. Basic anatomy, we'll be doing more of this when we get to the echinoderm lab. But pretty basic. They have the water vascular system. I'm not going to spend any time on that today. We'll do that when we get to the lab. And a reproductive system. So in each arm, you have a separate water vascular system, a separate reproductive tract, and a separate digestive system in each arm. So again, we'll talk about that later. Most of these guys have radial symmetry as adults. So the key to remember here is their larvae are bilaterans. When they go through metamorphosis into adults, they change to have radial symmetry. So these guys are considered bilaterans because their larval stage is bilateral. The living echinoderms are in 5 groups. Again, we will go over these more in lab. And also, I cannot pronounce them. This is the group that I struggle mightily just saying these words. A couple of them I can get. Asteroidea are the true sea stars. This is the one that kills me. Ophiuridia kills me. Echinoidea is the next one. Those are the sea urchins and sand dollars. Crinoidea, that one I can get, are the sea lilies. And Holothuridia, almost had it, are the sea cucumbers. Again, we'll do more in lab with those. Basics of this group is multiple arms radiating from a central disc. The undersurface has tube feet, which is used for gripping the substrate. Sea stars are strong enough that they can grab onto a clam, attach their tube feet to the clam, and pull the clam open. What they do then is their stomach extends out of their mouth, so their stomach actually wraps the clam in the stomach, and then they can pull it inside. So they actually don't use their arms for grabbing food. They use their stomach for grabbing food, you know, like weirdos. That stomach, when it's everted out of their body, they'll be digesting the food outside of their body as well. And a lot of sea stars can regrow lost limbs. So let's call it quits there today. We'll finish up this and start the next chapter on Thursday. I'm going to stop the recording now,